Everybody, over here in the to your left. I'm David Cash. I'm the Dean of the John W. McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at UMass. Governor's race, we've looked at the Secretary of State race and the congressional 7th District race. And we're hoping to do some more in the fall. It's been very exciting, a fantastic partnership, and I want to thank BUR and the Globe for us working together. Of course, I want to thank the candidates who are here today. Councilor Zakim and Secretary of State Galvin are in the room right now, so welcome. We'll get a chance to get to know them much better. I also want to thank our interim chancellor, Catherine Newman. You'll hear from her. Just started at UMass Boston. It's great to have her on campus. And before we get started with the kind of rules and logistics, and I will say there will be moments where there has to be silence. You'll be sitting and waiting, but that's all because this is going to be live. And very exciting to be able to have these kinds of debates live, not in the studio in front of an audience of concerned citizens. And that's one of the roles that we see at UMass Boston and at the McCormack Graduate School, is convening these kinds of discussions and debates. And it's hard to think of a time where these kinds of debates and discussions is not more important than it is now, with the kinds of policy questions that we're facing, the kinds of legal issues that we're all understanding about now, the questions about voting and cybersecurity, all front and center in how we think about politics and policy right now. So it's a pleasure to be part of this. So what I want to do now is welcome up Deborah Becker from WBUR. She's going to go through the kind of ground rules. And so Deborah, come on up or speak from there.
All right, can everyone hear me? I'll speak from here. Does that work okay? Oh, I'll speak in a minute. Okay, I can't speak right now, so you'll have to wait a minute.
I'm sorry, everyone. We'll hit what's called the billboard, which is the little piece of kind of what the show is about that you hear at the top of every hour, which is followed by a few minutes of news. So Deborah Becker will speak to us in that news break. If I might ask the candidates to come up, actually, as we hit the billboard, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
All right, good. So welcome. Thank you all for coming. This is very exciting, this very quiet race in Massachusetts. So I'm glad you're all here. We have a couple of rules that we want to go over with you before we begin. My name's Deborah Becker. James Pindle from the Boston Globe is with me as well. And so the debate will get underway in about 5 minutes from now. And I want to let you know that this is being broadcast live on WBUR. It's also on Facebook Live, so it is available on the WBUR website, on the UMass Boston website, on the website of the Boston Globe, so it will be streamed live. We are going to ask you to be very quiet when the beginning of the show starts. We will need complete silence as we introduce the show and introduce the debate. And I'd also ask you to limit your applause for the candidates. You will be able to applaud when you want to, but please limit it if you can until after the candidates are done speaking or after the debate. There are 2 times during the broadcast that I would actually like you to applaud. After I introduce James. Which is natural. Which, of course, you will applaud. I will raise my arms. If you could applaud for him, then that would be great. And at the end of the debate, when we conclude, I will raise my arms again. And if you could applaud, then that would be terrific as well. Also, because this is a live broadcast, please, no heckling, please no swearing. And I can tell you all kinds of stories about how that's happened on the air live before, but we don't want it to happen today. So let's not do that. Let's be respectful. And the candidates, those lights in front of the candidates right there, they're being timed. They will each get a minute to speak and a minute rebuttal, and those will tell them when they get to the red light, they have gone over time. They have to stop speaking. Their green means go, yellow means they have 15 seconds left, red means stop talking. So that is how the candidates are timed in terms of answering their questions. Just so you understand, those are the rules, and we'll be asking them questions and starting in just about 2 minutes. So if you need to get up and get a glass of water and take a breath before we start, then please do so now, and we will introduce the show. And again, when we introduce the show, which is right at about 3:07 exactly, we will need to have complete silence in the room. So thanks so much. Enjoy. From 90.9 WBUR, this is a special live edition of Radio Boston. I'm Deborah Becker.
And I'm Boston Globe political reporter James Pendle.
Today we're broadcasting live from the UMass Club in Boston. It's a special hour-long debate between Incumbent Secretary of State Bill Galvin and his primary challenger, Boston City Councilor Josh Zakim. They are the candidates running for the Democratic nomination for Massachusetts Secretary of State. This debate is hosted by WBUR, the McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at UMass Boston, and the Boston Globe.
Now, the Democratic primary will be held on September 4th before the general election on November 6th.
And we'll get started in just a moment with the candidates' opening statements. But first, I'm going to introduce UMass Boston Interim Chancellor Catherine Newman, and she's going to give us a brief welcome.
Good afternoon, diehard democracy fans. I am Catherine Newman, the Interim Chancellor of the University of Massachusetts Boston, and on behalf of my campus, my fearless leader, UMass President Marty Meehan, and the McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies, I want to welcome you to this important debate. Thank you so much, Deborah and James, and thanks to our partners at WBUR and the Boston Globe for making this debate and our ongoing series of debates possible. You know, convening these debates is central to our mission at UMass Boston to educate and to pursue the public trust and to make sure that airing public issues is central to your lives. I'd like to thank Dean David Cash and the McCormack Graduate School for joining with our partners and for all of the school's distinguished work. Finally, thank you to the candidates, Secretary of State Galvin and City Councilor Zakim, for being with us and for your many contributions to public service.
Thank you very much, Chancellor Newman. Thank you. So before we start the debate, a few ground rules we want to let our listening audience know about, as well as our live audience. The candidates will have 1 minute to respond to each question, followed by a 1-minute rebuttal. We, the moderators, James and I, will be able to ask follow-up questions of the candidates' responses at our discretion. Time will be kept with green, yellow, and red lights that are in front of the candidate podiums, so they will be able to see them as well. Yellow means 15 seconds left, and red means time is up.
And listeners, there are several ways you can participate. We're broadcasting a Facebook Live feed of today's event. You can go to bostonglobe.com, radioboston.org, as well as on Facebook at WBUR or the McCormack School to watch the feed.
Also, our hashtag on Twitter, where you can follow along, is hashtag MASOSdebate. So let's begin. We should let all of you know we did have a coin toss right before the live debate started as to who would give the first opening statement and the last closing statement in this debate. And Boston City Councilor Josh Zakim will give his opening statement first. I'd like to introduce him. He represents District 8, which includes the Back Bay, Beacon Hill, Fenway, Kenmore Square, Mission Hill, Audubon Circle, and the West End. He was elected to the council in 2013. Councilor Zakim, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here, and I want to thank everyone for taking time out of this beautiful summer afternoon to be here to talk about the important issues at stake in the Secretary of State's race. I'm incredibly proud to be standing before you here today as the endorsed Democratic candidate for Secretary of State in 2018. For the first time in a long time, people in Massachusetts have a real choice in the Secretary of State's race. As chair of the Civil Rights Committee on the Boston City Council, I've worked tirelessly to promote civil rights, inclusion, equity in our city and beyond. And it's time that we had a Secretary of State who took that same approach. Someone who's going to do everything that he or she can to lower barriers to access, to make it easier for eligible residents to participate in our elections. It's unacceptable that Massachusetts is not one of the 17 states with same-day registration, that we're only now finally moving towards automatic registration. We need weekend voting, early voting. That's why I'm here before you as your progressive candidate for Secretary of State in Massachusetts. There is so much more we can be doing with the power and authority in this office, and I'm asking for your support in the primary on September 4th, the day after Labor Day, to make that happen for Massachusetts. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. Now we're on to Incumbent Secretary of State Bill Galvin. Let me introduce you. He has been the Massachusetts Secretary of State since 1995, and before that, he was a state representative for the Allston-Brighton District. Secretary Galvin, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm very proud of my record in Massachusetts, and I think you should be proud of Massachusetts, too. We have a record number of eligible registered voters, over 4 million. We've had record participation in over 3 million in our last 2 presidential elections. My office, through its Financial Services Regulatory Authority, has returned millions of dollars to defrauded Massachusetts citizens and has led the way nationwide in showing up fraud in the financial services industry. We have used the historic tax credits that I worked very hard to get the authority to do to rebuild many buildings in Massachusetts into housing and other developable issues of readaptive use. We have made sure that our citizens know that there is somebody in the Secretary of State's office that's willing to help them, whether they want to form a new business, whether they want to find out information. We have modernized the methodology by which we give information to people. I'm particularly proud of our voter outreach, online registration, early voting, and many other things that we have innovated and brought into play in Massachusetts. And I'm very proud of my record and happy to talk about it here today.
All right, great. Did that in time. Well, I'd like to say we have 3 major topic areas that we'd like to ask you questions about today. But before we begin, we thought we would ask a general question for both of you. There are lots of serious issues. And before we get to them, let's talk about the issue of the tone of this campaign and why it has been nasty, why the ads have been nasty. Secretary Galvin, why do you think that's the case?
Well, I think you probably should have addressed that question to my opponent. I mean, my approach to the campaign has always been positive. I have reached out. My first advertising was a positive ad talking about our return of investments to individuals with real people who were victimized. The first advertisement that came from my opponent was an attack ad based on legislative votes from, in some cases, almost 40 years ago that are distortions of my record and concealed in a sense because he splits the ad, so 15 seconds is nice for him, and then 2 Toyota ads later, I get attacked. So obviously we have to respond to that, and we think the issue that we responded with is a relevant one, which is voting. I have a very proud record of helping people to vote. It's unfortunate he didn't take advantage of that.
Councilor, let's take up what he just said, two bits of that. One, he said his approach is to always be positive. Would you respond to that? And second, he did bring up the fact that you've been mentioning some votes he made 40 years ago. How is that relevant?
Well, thank you. Number one, this campaign began shortly after we announced with Secretary Galvin calling me names. I believe it's in the Boston Herald. He's continued to keep up those criticisms and those sorts of attacks from the very beginning of this campaign. And I would criticize our discussion completely based on the truth, based on the record. Secretary Galvin has denied making those votes on numerous occasions when he had the opportunity. He voted to prohibit abortion in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in all instances, including to save the life of a mother, including in cases of rape or incest. He voted to ban same-sex couples from adopting children in Massachusetts. He voted and led the fight against mail-in voter registration, calling it junk mail during his time in the legislature. These are relevant issues that people in Massachusetts should know about, and because it's the first time in 24 years they really have a choice in a campaign in this race, they should know that about their elected officials.
And why is this? Well, why is this so relevant to the Secretary of State's office, Councilor?
Is this me? Oh, thank you. It's relevant because in this day and age, in 2018, when President Trump is about to make a second appointment to the Supreme Court, when some of our values and rights are under attack like they have never been before, people need to know where their elected officials stand. We know where Mayor Walsh stands on this, and Maura Healey and Elizabeth Warren on these issues. They should know where their other statewide elected officials stand. We need advocates who are going to be standing up for us every day and fighting for these values. I have a record of doing that. My opponent's record is one of undercutting those values when he had the time in the legislature to do that.
Secretary Galvin, obviously there's a lot there. Go for it.
Yes, there is. First and foremost, let me speak to the inaccuracies of what has just been said. I, in fact, voted for the gay rights bill in Massachusetts when my opponent wasn't even 6 years old. That bill passed by 4 votes. I'm very proud to say I was one of the 4 votes. I also voted in favor of adoption by gay parents. And he has distorted a budget vote to try to make the case without any further explanation. As regards mail-in voter registration, in the 70s, before there was any systematic system statewide, there would be multiple mailings going to multiple clerks. In fact, I implemented mail-in voter registration and built the first network to do it. Lastly, let me speak to his comments regarding abortion. I have repeatedly filed with my party and stated publicly my belief that it's a personal choice. That is the law in Massachusetts. That, in fact, is what our Constitution has been interpreted to also provide. I have stated that. I would not have the support of such champions of women's rights, such as Karen Spilka, the current Senate President, and Harriet Chandler, the President Emeritus, if they did not know that's my record. More importantly, I have shown by my actions that I respect women. I protect women in our address confidentiality program. In fact, it was my law that provided the Civil Rights Act that has been used to protect access to clinics before there was a buffer zone. So to run deceptive ads, especially when they're clearly contradicted by the record, I think is a very disingenuous thing. You know, the most important qualification for this office is not your election law knowledge or even your knowledge of financial service. It's honesty. And on that front, I think I have a superior position.
Okay, Secretary Galvin. We want to talk about voting and election security, major issues in the Secretary of State's office. And we'd like to take a question on this from UMass Boston McCormack Graduate School Professor of Public Policy, Michael Ahn. Professor.
Thank you very much. My question is, we live in the age of information which cuts two ways. The internet is a boon to average people, but also to Russian hackers. Cybercrime threatens public trust in our electoral system, the very backbone of our democracy, and in the internet itself. Massachusetts is a technology leader. What more should we be doing to guarantee our elections are not compromised?
Let's start with Secretary Galvin. What steps has your office taken to make sure that Massachusetts elections remain secure?
Well, first and foremost, when it comes to voting, we only vote on paper ballots. I've never allowed any electronic equipment in here. It has to be licensed for it to come in here. I've never allowed it. The voter information, that is registration information, is kept on a closed system. I've kept it off the internet, and in fact, we don't even share it with other agencies of state government. But in addition to all of that, and contradicting another misstatement that's been made about my office, the fact of the matter is we have guarded and protected that system very carefully. We have full-time personnel who are regular state employees who do that on a 24-hour basis. We've also hired outside independent maintenance groups to maintain and protect the system and to challenge us, in a sense, to that protection long before 2016. And lastly, let me say that since we were not hacked in 2016, I think that's some evidence of the effectiveness of that. But we are not resting on our laurels. We have used the funds that are now being made available, in fact, to improve the security that we have. And I think we can speak to other states, as I have, about making sure their security is good, too. Because clearly in national elections, it is important what we have here in Massachusetts, and I'm proud of the record we have. But it's also important we make sure that other states are not victimized as well.
Thank you, Secretary. Councilor, this is obviously a very important topic nationwide. What would you do as Secretary of State to ensure that our elections are secure?
Well, number one, saying that just because we don't think we were hacked in 2016 means we're safe in 2018 and 2020 is not the right approach. Our voter registration system, our central voter file, is vulnerable. The Department of Homeland Security under both the Obama and current administrations have pointed that out as a central vulnerability in states across the country. Right now, we don't have a system of automatically backing it up and securing it at separate facilities. There are not full-time people assigned to this. Secretary Galvin talks about contractors he uses for this. One of these network specialists, who was a contractor in his office, was running a Ponzi scheme from right inside the Secretary of State's office. Are these the kind of people we're entrusting to protect our network security? We also need to be implementing things like risk-limiting audits after every state and federal election. That's becoming the new gold standard. It's something that Colorado and Rhode Island are working on. Massachusetts needs to be doing that too. We need to be securing our systems. We need to be tapping into the incredible brain power we have within just about a mile and a half of here, some of the brightest minds when it comes to cybersecurity in the country, if not the world, and we need to be prepared to protect our elections moving forward. That's what I will do.
Secretary Galvin.
Well, that's a complete misstatement. We do have people on our system. We built our network. We created it, and we have people, full-time people, who are employed by my office as regular state employees who protect the system 24 hours a day. We also have had contractors because that's the way we challenge and test the system we have. We have people who protect it and guide us and notify us outside of the state employees. We also have entities we've hired to challenge us to try to penetrate the system. We have not been hacked, but we are not resting on our laurels. In fact, what we have done is we've applied rapidly for any federal monies that are available. We've convened meetings of our advisors. We have a special security advisor on this issue. We've consulted with the Attorney General. She has been briefed, and she has stated publicly that she is very satisfied with our security plans. I think to continue to suggest to people that we do not have a secure system is a disservice.
Secretary, let's move on to a different topic. Your opponent and others have criticized your choice of having this primary date be on September 4th, the day after Labor Day. They argue that it lowers turnout, protects incumbents like yourself. Other states, of course, have had to deal with these Jewish holidays. Some have done it in August. Some have pushed it back even later. What's your response to why you picked that date and to this criticism?
Well, the first thing you have to know is that the biggest problem you always have on any primary in September is the federal law requires you to have ballots available 45 days before the November election. The statutory date for our primary set by the legislature was September 18th. So even if it were not a Jewish holiday, we would have had the issue of for 45 days being very tight at 49 days before. The legislature decided, confronting this problem year after year, that this time, thank you very much, they would let me choose the date, except they told me it had to be within 7 days of the second Tuesday. Well, the second Tuesday is September 11th, which is the second day of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. Of course, September 18th is Yom Kippur, so neither of those days are available. That really left a very few number of days. That left either the 4th, the 6th, or the 13th. The 13th would have been, again, sacrificing the ability for us to have recounts or review the results of the September primary. We have a very large contest going on up in the 3rd Congressional District that could result in a close election and a recount. And then the real practical choices came down to the 4th or the 6th. As you noted in your question, several states have resolved this by, most recently, Vermont and Connecticut, by holding their primary in August. I thought, even though I wasn't allowed to put it in August anyways, that would have been totally unacceptable. I thought, given the history we've had of the 4th, that we would check that date, which is a Tuesday.
Councilor Zakim, yes,
Sure.
you'd like to say something.
Thank you. Well, Secretary Galvin has quite an explanation at this point in the campaign for why we're having the primary, a statewide primary, for the first time ever the day after Labor Day. It's certainly a change in approach from just in 2016 when his office was very clear in talking about why having a primary the day after Labor Day would depress turnout, would not be convenient to voters. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence that this is the first time he's facing a challenge in a long time that he schedules the day after Labor Day. He mentioned the legislature gave the authority to set this as early as the 4th, which he did, or as late as the 18th. The League of Women Voters pushed very strongly for September 13th, a Thursday. I advocated trying this on a weekend for the first time. This is just another example of, I think, old school backroom politics and trying to accrue advantages to an incumbent. No one expects the day after Labor Day to increase turnout. That's not what we have here in Massachusetts. We should be having a Secretary of State who will do everything that he or she can to boost that participation.
Secretary Galvin, let's let you respond to that briefly.
Very briefly, the real choices were the Tuesday or the Thursday. It was Thursday in 2016. We had a lot of pushback because of school openings. The city of Boston opens its schools on that Thursday. We felt that would add a lot of confusion. Lastly, we have had Tuesday primaries after Labor Day. In fact, your president at University of Massachusetts, when he left, and the 3rd Congressional District, because of the law at that time, it required it to be on literally the day after Labor Day, and we had a very good turnout.
Thank you, Secretary. Let's move on to a different topic. Councilor Zakim, you have continually stressed the importance of voting and expanding voter access to the polls throughout this campaign. But as Secretary Galvin's campaign has pointed out, you declined to vote in more than a dozen elections prior to 2011. What's your response to this attack from the Secretary's campaign? And don't you believe that your stance as being a person who's going to increase voter turnout, particularly among younger people, is sort of undermined by your lack of participation in the past?
Well, I think that's certainly Secretary Galvin's intent with that attack. But I'm going to say these were, the overwhelming majority of these were local elections when I was in my teens and early 20s. Like many folks at that stage in their life, we're moving frequently, and we're not as engaged as I would have liked to have been in my local community. Since moving to Boston, since registering to vote here, I have not missed a single election. And if we're going to be talking about our records and our voting records, I think it's important that people know that when Secretary Galvin was a state representative on the public payroll, he missed 253 votes in his last term in office. That's nearly 25%. That is something that is a responsibility to his constituents while he's being paid taxpayer dollars to do a job and he wasn't doing it. I think the reforms I've been talking about in this campaign of same-day registration, early voting, weekend voting, making it easier for people to participate in their elections, to go directly to that, and make me a strong advocate and a strong ambassador for the need for those changes. But it pales in comparison to the abdication of duty by not showing up for nearly 25% of your votes as a state representative.
Secretary Galvin, respond to this, but also why is Councilor Zakim's record from when he was 20 years old important?
It's later than that. As a matter of fact, I thought the most egregious part of his failure to vote was he failed to vote in the 2004 presidential primary and presidential election. You may recall that was a very close election between George W. Bush and John Kerry, and he didn't vote. I also think it's significant that he has continually criticized me, and I can almost quote him verbatim, I've heard this so many times, that since 2002, primary turnouts have dropped, and it's my fault. Well, if you don't vote in 2004 and 2006, and I think subsequently in the state primary in 2008, then it's not my fault. You know, if you're an advocate for voter rights, you should participate. If you're an advocate saying to others you should vote and encouraging people to vote, as I have all during my tenure, you need to participate. I think it's hypocritical not just to criticize me for the decline in turnouts that he purports to report, but also not to have the credibility in terms of approaching voters to come out and vote in their elections.
Okay. I just want to remind our listeners that this is a special edition of Radio Boston, live from the UMass Club. This is the Democratic debate for Massachusetts Secretary of State. It's sponsored by WBUR and our partners at UMass Boston's McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies, also the Boston Globe. We have with us the two Democratic Secretary of State candidates, Incumbent Secretary William Galvin and Challenger Boston City Councilor Josh Zakim. We are broadcasting live on 90.9 WBUR. We're also streaming live video at WBUR.org, thebostonglobe.com, as well as on Facebook at WBUR or the McCormack School. You can go there to watch the feed. So now we're going to shift gears and go to topic number 2.
That's right. We're going to turn to the issue of transparency, and this question is for Secretary Galvin. You know, one of the major duties of your office, as you know, is to oversee public records. You've been criticized over the years for some cases involving the release of public records. In 2016, the journalism group Investigative Reporters and Editors named you and State Public Records Supervisor Sean Williams as finalists for their Golden Padlock Award, which is something they give to public officials who obstruct transparency. Why has this been such a flashpoint for you?
I don't think it necessarily is a flashpoint for me. We had a very bad statute, which was very limiting in the ability to access public records. I was very involved in reforming that statute in 2017. Since that reform and the appointment of a new supervisor who has done an excellent job, 97% of the requests are upheld from citizens, and they're turned around in less than 10 days. On the fee appeals, that is to say, agencies applying a high fee, only 6% of those have been upheld as legitimate fees. So therefore, 94% have been overturned. The fact of the matter is the statute is still bad. The legislature continues to exempt itself, which we oppose. The judiciary continues to be exempted, which we oppose. And the executive branch, under a case called the Lambert decision, continues to evade a lot of public inspection. I continue to work, or my supervisor of public records, who has done an excellent job, continues to work to make changes in this. The changes that have occurred would not have occurred without our advocacy for them at the legislative level.
Councilor Zakim, I'm just wondering, do you agree with what the Secretary has said about public records? And if you were elected, what would you do about this office? How would you go about making changes?
Well, I think even giving credence to what the Secretary is saying about the last 2 years, he was Supervisor of Public Records, Secretary of State for the last 24 years. I can tell you one thing, that when Josh Zakim is Secretary of State, we're not going to be any list of nominees for Golden Padlock Awards. In every instance, I will err on the side of transparency. And, you know, he is correct that the legislature needs to reform the law even further, but there's a lot of discretion for a proactive Secretary of State to push for more transparency. Unless there is a clear exemption under the law, as Secretary of State, I will order documents to be turned over. The fact that we've had an average cost of nearly $4,500 for public records requests over the last couple decades under the Secretary's tenure is unacceptable. If we're asking people to listen to this debate, to participate in our elections, to hold their elected officials accountable, they need to know how decisions are being made, who has a seat at the table. And that comes whether you're talking about your local zoning board or school committee, a police department, the Mass State Police, or even the governor's office. And we need to hold those folks accountable, reform our public records laws, and be more proactive on requiring disclosure and transparency.
Secretary Galvin, your response?
Yes. When Councilor Zakim talks about high fees, I could cite a case that you might be familiar with. WBUR just asked about the fees that were being proposed by the Boston Police Department to get body camera footage. And in fact, we have overruled them, and in fact ruled in favor of WBUR. But I also have to point out that one of the greatest offenders in the state is in fact the city of Boston. Whether it's the Boston Redevelopment Authority or the Boston Police Department, they're constantly non-responding under the new law to what should be done. I've never heard anything coming out of the Boston city government about dealing with that. If you're so interested in transparency, you might begin at home.
I want to move. Let's move to a different topic. Councilor Zakim, you argue that you are the progressive candidate in this race and you represent progressive values, but you refuse to sign the People's Pledge, which is something, as you know, progressive Elizabeth Warren first offered. It would bar taking outside money to get involved in this race. Doesn't not taking the People's Pledge undercut this progressive argument you give?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I'm proud to say that as of about a week ago, we did sign a pledge. I'm the only candidate that has signed a pledge rejecting both outside spending and PAC contribution to this campaign. What we did add on to that pledge was a request for 2 more debates in the interest of transparency. I think the folks here would enjoy that. I think the folks listening on the radio. Secretary Galvin has not signed that. I am the only candidate in this race to have disavowed outside spending, to disavow PAC contributions to the campaign, and I think that's incredibly important. You're right. We should do this, and I would ask Secretary Galvin if he would like to sign our progressive pledge and agree to the 2 more debates, and otherwise it's substantively the same as his original proposal.
But you've got about a little more than a week before 2 debates would even be possible. It's only a little bit more than a week before 2 debates would be even possible. Would you only sign that pledge if the Secretary agreed to those debates?
Well, he's done a good job of running out the clock. We've starting about 6 months ago, challenge to a series of debates. We were trying to do this every month. So listen, I think we do owe it to folks to debate. I'd be willing to do that every day from now until the election. I think it's important. But, you know, I challenged Secretary Galvin to sign that pledge, rejecting outside spending, rejecting PAC money. If he wants to agree to that, that'd be great. We can sign it right here.
But only if the debates happen.
I think that's an important component of transparency, and I certainly am available to schedule those.
Okay. Secretary Galvin.
Well, first and foremost, as you correctly pointed out, the debate has nothing to do with the issue of dark money or money from undisclosed sources or corporate money or excess contributions. Mr. Zakim's first position was he was against it. He said that it was extraneous, I was distracting people with this. But when he got heat on it, he suddenly sent this so-called progressive pledge. And he conveniently had me returning half of my PAC money, which was legally reported and raised, but he conveniently neglected to mention the $5,000 he took from Local 103, which was General Treasury Fund money. I sent back the proposal 3 days ago, happily willing to give up my PAC money, provided he incorporated the $5,000 into it. Of course, since that time, we've also discovered that he also got an unauthorized or so-called independent expenditure contribution that was reported by the Chinese Progressive Association. So obviously, we'd have to amend that as well. But I have been upfront in the beginning. I've said from day one, I'm not receiving funds from outside sources that are not reporting to OCPF. He has failed to do that up to this minute. I sent him back that reform proposal.
I have it right here.
No,
Signed
I
proposal
sent back
right
the
here.
reform proposal 3 days ago now. 3 days, and it still hasn't been returned. We sent it at 3 o'clock on the 21st.
It took us a week to get a response from you on ours. So
well, the first response you had was you weren't going to sign it, and you said you belittled me for sending it to you.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
okay.
Thank you very much. Well, I find it interesting that Secretary Galvin, for all his purported support for labor, would like to exclude unions, labor organizations, from contributing to political candidates. I'm proud to have the support of the men and women of IBEW 103, and they are proud to stand with me in this race. I think it is disingenuous. I don't think it's very progressive. I don't think it's supportive of the labor movement to ask for labor organizations who contribute to political campaigns, who are using their collective voices to stand up for some of the rights we all believe in, to stay out of races like this. That's something I would expect Governor Baker to suggest in his campaign. I would suggest a Republican to suggest that. And to address the issue of the Chinese Progressive Association, they are focused on voter rights. They are a small grassroots organization located in Chinatown that you've had clashes with in the past because you took them to court to prevent the transliteration of ballots for Chinese speakers who are entitled to cast their votes. Now, I don't think that's something that a progressive Secretary of State would be doing or should be doing, and I certainly wouldn't as Secretary of State.
Secretary Galvin.
Let's set the record straight on labor money. It was Mr. Zakim who proposed that I should give up my legally raised PAC contributions from labor. He's the first person to introduce that into it. And I'm saying if it helps to get a pledge, I'm willing to do it. But you have to include your labor contributions as well, which is $5,000, not from donations to a PAC, but from the campaign, from the Treasury, from dues paid by union members. If we're going to have donated funds that are voluntarily given to PACs from labor excluded or reduced, then we should also do it for the general funds. As far as the Chinese Progressive Association, it's not their mission that I have a problem with. It's the category that they made their contribution in. It was a third-party expenditure. The whole purpose of a pledge is to exclude them. If you're going to say, yes, we can take them, then what happens when some nefarious PAC from another state suddenly decides They want to start spending money. As we've seen, all of us who live here in Massachusetts get to see the New Hampshire Follies every other year, that all this money coming in from the Chamber of Commerce and all these other places. That's precisely what Elizabeth Warren and Scott Brown agreed to take out. That's precisely what Ed Markey and Steve Lynch agreed not to accept, and that's precisely what I proposed, and I'm still willing to accept. But he's come up with all these dodges to avoid signing.
I am the only candidate in this race.
Go ahead, Councilor.
I am the only candidate in this race to have signed a pledge rejecting outside spending and PAC money. Secretary Galvin has still not. Now, if you're so afraid to have another debate or another 2 debates in this campaign, if that's the stumbling block, then maybe we should talk about this offline and talk about it and get this done. But I don't understand what your hesitation to agreeing to debates in the interest of transparency is. The voters deserve it, and I think they should get it.
At this point, yes. Go ahead, Secretary. You've got
I'll
about
be brief
20
because there are
seconds
other
here.
topics. I have gone to every credible forum there has been, every single one. And in many instances, Mr. Zakim has questioned whether they were debates. The sponsors said they were. I have been at every credible forum, every single one, and I've certainly been at many others where we both appeared and spoken and questions have been taken. I certainly have not dodged anything. I also have a day job that I have to work at, which is making sure this election runs properly. So as we approach the election, I want to make sure that happens too.
Okay, that is time. Thank you both. I want to remind our listeners that you are listening to a special edition of Radio Boston Live from the UMass Club. This is the Democratic debate for the Massachusetts Secretary of State. It's sponsored by WBUR and our partners at UMass Boston's McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies and the Boston Globe. The 2 Democratic candidates are with us, Incumbent Secretary William Galvin and Challenger Boston City Councilor Josh Zakim. We are broadcasting live on 90.9 WBUR. We're also streaming live video on WBUR.org, thebostonglobe.com, as well as on Facebook at WBUR or the McCormack School. You can go there to watch the feed. We're going to switch topics.
Councilor Zakim, I want to come back to an issue that we talked about a little bit earlier this hour. You continue to raise issues like abortion and gay rights in this race, and yet when you were asked by the Boston Globe to name a single action Secretary Galvin has taken or a specific power of the office that affects those issues, you are unable to come up with an answer. So why do you continue to raise these issues if these are essentially irrelevant to the position that you're running for?
I think that's for the voters to decide what's relevant and what's not when it comes to the values that their elected officials hold. And I'll say that at no time in the last 40 years have we been closer to seeing a Roe versus Wade overturned or severely curtailed by the U.S. Supreme Court. President Donald Trump is about to make his second appointment to the Supreme Court. Whoever it is certainly someone who is going to take a dim view of Roe and a woman's right to choose. When Secretary Galvin had the ability to vote on these issues, in direct contemplation of Roe being overturned, he voted on numerous occasions to prohibit abortion in Massachusetts in all cases, including to save the life of a mother, including in cases of rape and incest, and he has not rejected those prior views. This is unacceptable in 2018 in Massachusetts. Voters deserve to know what values their elected officials hold, that they're going to stand up and fight for them when we are under attack by the Trump administration and a new justice system and a new Supreme Court. You know, it's interesting that in all the votes he missed as a legislator, Secretary Galvin made sure to be there to cast those votes, to curtail a woman's right to choose, to prohibit same-sex couples from adopting in Massachusetts. Voters need to know that, and they on their own will determine what's relevant in this race.
Both of you have been criticized for...
Can I respond?
Oh, yes, you can respond.
Thank you very much. First of all, I've already laid out, and I'll be happy to provide the documentation regarding the gay adoption issue. It's outrageous, in light of my record that's demonstrable and clear, that you continue to make that statement. Regarding abortion, I've made it very clear, not just in what I've said, what I've done, what I've filed in writing, my position. You also know, sir, that our state Supreme Court has consistently interpreted the state constitution to protect women's access to all of these. So to raise fear among women in Massachusetts based upon this election or any other is highly irresponsible. You know, I spend my time, a lot of my time, working to make sure that women are kept out of fear with our address confidentiality program. I think it's outrageous that you would put them in fear. And in fact, even Joan Vanocchi, writing for the Globe on this very topic, has said that it was fear-mongering what you're doing, and that's continuing what you're doing today. I think it's an effort to hide your total lack of qualifications for the office you seek.
Secretary, just to make sure for listeners just becoming aware of this issue, do you consider yourself pro-choice or not?
consider myself somebody who says it's a personal choice. That is exactly what our Constitution is. It is relevant, not relevant what I might think in a given situation. What's relevant is that every woman would have the right to make the choice she wants to make, and that's the law in Massachusetts, and that's what it should remain.
But that
Go ahead.
That law is very much at risk of changing in 2018 with a Trump Supreme Court. Mr. Secretary, you do not share the views of the voters in Massachusetts. As you pointed out in a letter you wrote to the state party during your first run for statewide office, that you rejected the plank in the platform to protect a woman's right to choose. This is a current issue. This is an issue the voters deserve to know about. What are your views on this issue? Do you believe in protecting a woman's right to choose?
You know, I've said it now very clearly. I believe that a woman should have that right, and I've said it clearly, and I've pointed out our Constitution protects it.
Would you take those same votes?
I think things have changed a great deal. Our Constitution has been interpreted to protect those rights, and I certainly believe that's the way it should remain.
Okay, we are going to ask the questions. Both of you have been criticized for having public employees do campaign work for you. Secretary Galvin, you said an internal review is happening in your office regarding that. What's the status of that?
It was completed. We had an internal review. We disciplined 3 employees. It's important to point out what the violation was. They filed a petition that they had a legal right to file. It was the time of day they filed it. They filed it in 3 cases while they were still on state time, not on their own time. When we discovered that by completing or reviewing the time logs, we docked them for that time. We put a letter in their file. We disciplined them. I think it's fair to say that these transactions, and I know since Mr. Zakim's employee did the same thing at City Hall in his re-election effort in 2017, I guess, it's a short thing. It's 10, 15 minutes. But we took the time away from these people. We don't have people working on campaigns who are on the payroll. What they do in their own time, what they do to voluntarily, that's certainly their right. They don't lose their rights as citizens.
Councilor Zakim.
Sure. Listen, I think having folks in the Elections Division, in the Secretary of State's office, including former elected officials themselves, who should have known better to be doing campaign work on the government clock is unacceptable. When I'm Secretary of State, folks in the Elections Division will not be permitted to volunteer or give their time to my campaign in the interest of transparency, in the interest of making sure that people know the folks who are calling the balls and strikes in our elections are completely nonpartisan. And it's interesting to note, we have this going on and on. It's been 24 years Secretary Galvin's been in place. There should be procedures in place, management procedures. I'm curious if some of the folks who receive many of the contracts that his office gives out, no-bid contracts, about $1 million in the last 2 years, to politically connected Beacon Hill insiders, to former employees, to former elected officials, were those people also part of this review, and have they been campaigning on your public time, and why have these no-bid contracts been awarded?
Councilor Zakim, I want to move on to a different topic here. The Office of Secretary of State has an annual budget of almost $270 million and oversees at least 9 different departments, including the Registry of Deeds, the Securities Division, the State Record Center, and the Citizen Information Service. What in your background qualifies you to take on that level of leadership?
I think it's, as you described, it's an incredibly important role, and there is so much potential there for someone who has a vision for the Secretary of State's office, for reforming these things, for reforming the management practices that have allowed someone who works as a network specialist in the Secretary of State's office to operate a Ponzi scheme, bilking hundreds of people out of millions of dollars right inside that office, from someone who has employees on the government payroll doing that. It's clear that there needs to be a top-to-bottom review in that office. I'm proud of the work I've done, both as an attorney at Greater Boston Legal Services, where I held important institutions and powerful institutions like Bank of America and Wells Fargo accountable for their treatment of borrowers, my work as a lawyer, and my work on the Boston City Council. We have legislated on important issues ranging from voting rights and civil rights, overseeing the City of Boston's $3.2 billion budget. These are all important factors, but nothing substitutes for a vision for that office, for making needed reforms, for making that Secretary of State's office a place for proactive leadership that can address some of these issues in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Okay, Secretary Galvin, you should respond to that. There's quite a bit there. To respond to. So why don't we explain to folks the employee that we're talking about in your office?
Well, he's not an employee. That's again another misstatement that's been corrected publicly several times. A contractor, a person employed by an outside contractor who, when he did services for my office, worked primarily in the Registry of Deeds. He was not an employee of the office. And in fact, the firm that he was hired by had several other persons working in our office or working for us. It was a service contractor. He was accused of a Ponzi scheme by the federal government. Once we discovered that was the case, he was terminated, and his company was terminated. The company providing him was terminated forthwith. He had absolutely no involvement whatsoever with the Securities Division. Again, a misstatement. We got rid of the person. Now, in light of the developments of the last 24 hours at Boston City Hall, where you had a person indicted, I guess I should hold the city council responsible for that. I don't, because I don't think he should be held responsible for independent people who do what they do. And if we had no reason to know, and we would certainly not have any reason to know about a contractor or somebody providing services, then I think it is absolutely irrelevant. I think the bigger point is this. It is a vast administrative office with many responsibilities. It has responsibilities in the area of financial services that I think are critically important. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Zakim has taken tens of thousands of dollars from people in the financial services business. How is he going to regulate? How is he going to enforce this when, in fact, he is going to take money from people who've ripped off citizens of Massachusetts, who I've disciplined? In the case, for instance, of LPL Financial, I've disciplined them 8 times, gotten back millions of dollars for Massachusetts residents, and he takes contributions from the former CEO who he disciplined. I'm sure they're very happy to hope that I'm gone so that they come in and do business and rip people off again.
Okay,
that's the kind of leadership that we don't need.
That's time. We're going to let Councilor Zakim, yes, you may respond to that.
Well, if we're going to talk about who's contributing to our campaign, I think Mr. Galvin should talk about the folks who have given tens of thousands of dollars in contributions to his campaign, who has he then turned around and in just the last 2 years given $1 million in no-bid contracts. What's happening here? Who are these folks? Are these the contractors we're talking about who are supposedly securing our elections, these politically connected Beacon Hill insiders, former elected officials, your friends and campaign contributors? What's happening there?
So you're alleging that the Secretary's office is awarding no-bid contracts to folks who are contributing to his campaign?
Yes, and on the front of Mr. Herod, who's running a Ponzi scheme. You say he's a contractor. He worked there for 9 years. He had a voicemail. He was in your employee directory. I'm curious, did the FBI or the U.S. Attorney's Office reach out to you or your securities division before they made those indictments, before they made those arrests, as you are the securities regulator for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts?
Okay, these are 2 very big questions. These are 2 big questions, and I think you talked a little bit about Mr. Herod, the contractor who's working. If you want to clarify that first, Secretary, but also no-bid contracts.
Let me start with the no-bid contracts. There are no no-bid contracts. We have individuals who retired from state service who have expertise. For instance, the former director of elections, who has retired for some years now, he's on a service contract because he specializes in making sure we have enough ballots printed for each and every precinct. He has a unique skill. We use him very well. We have people who retired who have particular skills in securities. For instance, we have a gentleman who for years licensed people coming into Massachusetts and knows fraud when he sees it. He chose to retire. We bring him back. It used to be for 960 hours. Sometimes it's for less. Those are not no-bid contracts. Those are retired employees who we bring back. We bid contracts. We are required to bid contracts for goods and services. And whenever there is an issue, we put it out for bid. And we try to get the best bet we can for Massachusetts in terms of the value we provide. We put out printing contracts. They're all put out for bid. I've resisted overtures through the years from people, political people, to give printing contracts. We don't do it. So to characterize these people as that is wrong. Mr. Herod was a contractor. He had nothing to do with securities, and we were not previously notified of any investigation relating to him.
I think what the charge that Councilor Zakim is referring to is a political consulting firm that does your campaign ads, that may do some contracts for the state.
Well, they're not no bid. There was an RFR put out in the State Goods and Services Bulletin, published. We put out a bid prior to the 2016 election cycle, the presidential primary of the election. We put out a bid. There were only 2 respondents. Both of them we knew about. One of them is a Massachusetts-based company. We gave them some business. The other is the one I think you're referring to. We've given them some business. You know, it's analogous to having a situation where if somebody does a great job, the state hires somebody to put in carpeting, and you think the carpeting is great, and you want to go to the same company and buy carpeting, as long as you pay full price. And believe me, when it comes to any services I paid for personally or through my committee, I've paid full price. Then it's perfectly legitimate. It would be impossible to say, well, somebody's a great painting contractor. They work for the state. You can't hire them, even if you're paying them for the full amount that they value. It's a service contract. It's like nothing else. That's all it is. So there's certainly no conflict. We can show you where the RFR was put out. We can show you the responses that they got, and they do good work.
Thank you.
Councilor, just briefly, a little response to that to clarify exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. Oh, there was a lot in there in Mr. Galvin's response. I will say that the public has a right to know why campaign contributors are getting these no-bid contracts, and I look forward to seeing more about that information. And certainly, as Secretary of State, I would do what some of our other constitutional officers have done, and voluntarily submit to an open bid process. We would not be awarding these no-bid contracts to political contributors, and we certainly keep a better eye on our contractors so that they're not committing Ponzi schemes in the Secretary of State's office.
20 seconds, Secretary. Anything further to say on that?
Well, again, he continues to repeat no-bid contracts. We'll be happy to show you the RFR. He continues to suggest individuals, and I've identified these are individuals with particular skill, and oftentimes the amount of compensation they get in a year might be $20,000 for work. They actually show up to work, not like some other folks. And they do get paid for what they do, and they do great work. And I want to use their expertise because it's cheaper than hiring people I'd have to train.
Thank you so much, Secretary. We're going to move on to a lightning round, one answer or so. Keep it a little light here for a second. Secretary, what was the most recent TV show you binged watched?
I don't binge watch. So it would be years ago. It was probably on public television.
Very good.
Okay, how about your favorite morning coffee order?
Coffee, I take my coffee with cream, no sugar, and I usually try to have a muffin. That's it.
How about you, Councilor?
On the TV shows, when my wife Grace is here today, get some time together. We do like to watch some things that we both enjoy. The Wire is a favorite show, and we like to watch some of the sillier ones on reality TV occasionally as well.
Political leader you most admire, past or present?
Sure.
Councilor first.
We have so many wonderful leaders here in Massachusetts. Certainly, I think the work that Teddy Kennedy did here in Massachusetts has been vital in leading this country. But someone that I often look to for guidance and leadership, although he's not here anymore, is my father, Lenny, who wasn't a political leader. He was a community activist. He was a civil rights leader. And, his lessons of how to be one and out in the community and caring about other issues and fighting for causes that might not be popular but that are the right thing have guided me every single day, from when he passed away when I was 15 years old to this current campaign. And it's something I look to as a source of strength and guidance, and I certainly think that's where I see a lot of my guidance from.
Again, lightning round here, quickly. I understand.
Yes, go ahead, Secretary. Very
one more
briefly.
question for you. What's your favorite meal?
Probably chicken parmesan.
Good choice.
And the political leader that you most admire.
I'd say, if I may, two who are still living, I'm happy to say, and have provided some guidance to me, both because of the longevity of my service. One is Michael Dukakis. When I first came to the legislature, he was the governor. He was a very hard-working governor, served a great term, multiple terms, and did a great job, and he's still a leader. The other is Francis Expelati, who took an office that had traditionally been overlooked or politicized in the Attorney General's office and professionalized it. I like to think that I've emulated both of them during my tenure.
Okay, it's time for closing statements. As we said, this was decided by coin toss. Councilor Zakim, we'll start with you. You have 1 minute.
I believe Secretary Galvin.
Oh, Secretary Galvin, we'll start with you. You have
Well,
1
fine,
minute.
thank you very much. I'm happy to have that opportunity. I think we all know the importance of elections. If we didn't know it before 2016, we certainly know it now. But it's also important who runs elections to make sure they're accurate and fair. I'm proud of the honest election record we have. And candidly, I don't think there's a more important election than the 2020 presidential election. I think it's the most important election we've had in this country since the Civil War. And I think it's critically important to make sure that not only our citizens here in Massachusetts have their votes counted properly and correctly, but it's also important that we make sure that occurs throughout the rest of the country. I think I have the reputation and the relationships with the other places in the country to make sure, and a voice to speak out about irregularities in various places, to make sure that the 2020 election, which is so critical, is conducted fairly. I truly believe it is the most important election we're going to see in this country for a long, long time. Thank you.
Councilor Zakim, closing statement. You have 1 minute.
Well, thank you. I do think the upcoming 2020 election is crucial in the history of our country, and I think it's crucial that Massachusetts is a leader when it comes to elections issues, not just election security, but voter access and participation. I'm running for Secretary of State because Massachusetts needs to be a leader once again in this area. As we've led so many times throughout our history, from the original resistors of the Revolution to the abolition movement to health care reform to marriage equality to, in this day and age, in 2018, not be one of the 17 states with same-day registration, not to have weekend voting for our elections, not to have early voting in our primaries is unacceptable. We need a progressive, proactive Secretary of State who is going to take a top-to-bottom look at these issues and make sure that Massachusetts is a leader when it comes to these vital fights. We need to stand up for our values against the Trump administration, against these attacks that are coming every day. That's why I'm running to be your Secretary of State in 2018. That's why I'm asking for your vote in the primary on September 4th, the day after Labor Day. Thank you so much.
Okay, and that is time for all of us today. Stick with WBUR and the Boston Globe for coverage of the Democratic primary on September 4th. We want to thank our guests today, Democratic candidates for Massachusetts Secretary of State, Incumbent Bill Galvin. Thank you very much. Also, Boston City Councilor Josh Zakim. Thanks to both of you. Also, a special thank you to our partners at the Boston Globe and to James Pindle, Boston Globe political reporter, my co-host today. Thank you.
And thank you, Deborah. We also want to thank our other co-sponsor, the McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at UMass Boston. And thanks to our audience, on air, online, and here at the UMass Club.
Okay, you can listen back to this full debate on our websites, radioboston.org and bostonglobe.com. Don't forget to vote on September 4th. I'm Deborah Becker, and this is Radio Boston.